Death and the Cornish Fiddler by Deryn Lake. Side 5. There was no sign of the Marchesa, but the three ladies, namely Mrs. Legassick, Mrs. Bligh, and the omnipresent Anne Anstey, were partaking of afternoon tea. They made much of the arrival of the two men, inviting them to join them. Tim Painter refused, quite abruptly, John thought. "Thank you, but no. Mr. Rawlings and I are bound for the tap-room." Anne Anstey made a moo and smiled widely. "How tired you gentlemen must be. Did you find little Isabel?" "No. Isn't she here?" asked Tim, surprised out of his lethargy. "We haven't seen her," said Mrs. Bligh. "God's life! Perhaps she's gone directly upstairs." He turned to John. "Rawlings, old chap, go and check the situation for me. I can't abide any more of Mrs. P's hysterics." And with that most handsome of creatures strode off in the direction of the bar. John, only too aware of Anne Anstey's warm glances, bowed and left them equally quickly, climbing the stairs to where he knew Catherine was lying, hopefully unconscious. The physic he had given her had been a combination of mistletoe, valerian root, and vervain in equal parts. This was a well-known remedy for nervous disorders, and should also have had a certain sedative effect. Hoping for the best, the apothecary knocked extremely gently on the door. Somewhat to his dismay, a voice immediately answered, "Come in." She was sleepy, there was no doubt about that, but had not actually gone to sleep. Instead, Mrs. Pill lay in a darkened room, her eyes closed, but for all that still conscious. "Isabel, have you found her?" "She was in the vicinity of the church, Mrs. Pill. She's perfectly safe, and has not fallen into the low pool." Catherine reared up in the bed, looking far from attractive. "Where is she? Is she downstairs?" No, not exactly." "Then where have you hidden her? What's happening? Oh, God, spare me from further misery." She started to weep again, and John's hand automatically reached for the salts which he always carried about his person. "Mrs. Pill, please don't distress yourself. Take a deep breath from this bottle." "I don't want your horrid sniffs. Take them away. What have you done with my girl? Where have you hidden her? What game are you playing with me, apothecary?" "None at all, I assure you, madam. The fact is that Mr. Painter and I must have missed her by 10 minutes or so. We then searched the town high and low, but I'm afraid that Isabel eluded us." "So she's still not been found?" "No," John answered flatly. "I'm sorry, but those are the facts." Mrs. Pill let out a terrible gurgle and fell back on the bed with a thud. Realizing that the shock had been too great and she had fainted, the apothecary hurried to her side. His medical bag was downstairs where he had left it earlier, and now he ran down to retrieve it. Thankfully, all the ladies had gone about their business and the parlour was empty. Snatching the bag up, John hurried back to his patient, and while she was unconscious, took the opportunity of administering some more of the sedative he had given her previously. Then, by holding his salts beneath her nose, he brought her round once more. She wept quietly, and the apothecary felt so sorry for her that he put his arms round her. "She will come back," he said, but even as he uttered the words, he wondered to himself whether he was speaking the truth. Tim Painter was well away by the time John caught up with him. He had also been joined by young Nicholas Kitto, this evening looking like a sleek and happy ginger cat, wearing an emerald green suit cut by a tailor from Redruth, or so he informed the apothecary. This particular garment enhanced his naturally red hair and freckles, so that with his strangely fine features the fellow looked positively handsome. "Are you coming to the ball tonight?" he inquired of the other two men. "No, I shall remain here and see what's what," Tim answered, slanting his eyes. "I would like to go. How does one get hold of tickets?" said John. "From the landlord of the Angel. The ballroom is here. But hurry, it may well be sold out." At that moment, from the street outside, there came the familiar strains of music, and Elizabeth appeared bearing Rose, large-eyed, in her wake. There was the usual stirring of male disapproval, but the Marchesa ignored it and walked up to the group fearlessly. "Gentlemen, good evening. As you can hear, the dancers are returning. Tell me, did you find the child?" "Little beast eluded captivity once more," answered Tim in his beautiful voice, never taking his eyes off the Marchesa, who returned look for look. Nicholas turned to John. "Sir, will you present me to the lady?" The apothecary, feeling somewhat put out, performed the introductions, remarking as he did so how charmingly Elizabeth curtsied, and how well Nicholas conducted himself while the formalities were obeyed. Rose, meanwhile, took refuge behind her father's legs, staring out at all that was taking place with all-seeing eyes. John, suddenly aware of her presence, bent down to her. "Shall we go outside and watch the dancers, sweetheart?" "Yes, Papa, I would like that." He straightened up and looked at Elizabeth. "Rose and I are going to see what is going on. Would you care to join us?" "Very much. Excuse me, gentlemen." Both Nicholas and Tim made disapproving noises, but accepted the Marchesa's departure with reasonable grace. Once outside, she turned to John with a brilliant look. "I have bought 2 tickets for the ball tonight. Do you want to come? Or should I ask Tim Painter to accompany me?" "Are you serious?" John asked severely. "Of course not. I would prefer to dance with you." "Then nothing would give me greater pleasure than to be your partner." Elizabeth looked businesslike. "What is happening about Isabel? Has she been seen, or was it just a false rumour?" "No, the vicar saw her near the church. It's the damnedest thing, but the child is definitely avoiding capture." "Why? Nobody is cruel to her. In fact, her mother dotes on her, I would say." "Yes, but Tim might be handy with his fists. He openly admits that he dislikes the child." The Marchesa shook her head. "No, he hasn't got it in him to beat anyone. He's too indolent, too relaxed. The only thing that would arouse him from his torpor is the pursuit of a pretty woman. He's involved with Mrs. Pill because she's been left a considerable amount of cash, apparently." "I thought it would be something like that." Rose, whom they had temporarily forgotten, suddenly piped up. "Oh, see the ladies. Don't they look strange?" John followed the line of her pointing finger, and saw Mrs. Legassick, Mrs. Bligh, and Mrs. Anstey cavorting down the street in what appeared to be an odd form of Morris dance. Partnering them were the 2 brothers, Geoffrey and Gregory Colquite, and their cousins Eustace Sayce and Herbert Rees. What it was about the dance that was unusual, the apothecary could not possibly have said, but it seemed as if all 7 of them were abandoning themselves to the music, dancing wildly, and as if their very lives depended on it. Even respectable Muriel Legassick appeared to be quite worked up, her little mouth in a tight line, her eyes glistening. John smiled to himself, glad to see such a decent bunch of people enjoying themselves in so uninhibited a manner. "Odds my life," said Elizabeth, laughing to herself. "I'm sure they rival the Furry Dancers themselves." But she had spoken too soon, for down the street in a great and colourful line were coming the gentry folk, refreshed and ready to dance the night away. Watching them, the apothecary thought them almost magical. The women dressed finely in vivid colours, hats and bonnets upon their heads, the men in their turn in their best clothes, glittering buckles winking upon their shoes as they whirled their partners in the brilliant sunlight. And it was then that he caught a glimpse, and glimpse only it was, of little Isabel. Just for a second, the crowd of onlookers across the street parted, and he distinctly saw her, dancing along, parodying the adults. He caught her eye, gestured to her, called her name. She heard him, stared at him. Then she vanished once more, and it was with that one brief sighting he had to be content. Even if he hadn't caught her, he knew she was safe, and would no doubt return when she finally grew tired. By the end of the evening, he was deeply in love. The sight of Elizabeth in white muslin, her black hair cascading round her shoulders, worn loose and unconventional, had driven him practically mad. As he had partnered her through the dances for 6 or 8 couples, he resented the moments when he had to leave her and dance with the other women in the set, glad when she put her gloved hand back in his and gave him an unreadable glance. That she was deliberately playing with him, the apothecary had no doubts, but he had no power to prevent it. Emilia was starting to fade into memory, yet she would still come in the night to haunt his dreams. Had he loved her as much as he loved Elizabeth, he asked himself? Yet there could be no comparison of the depth of his feelings. He felt that his marriage, and all the many memories that were attached to it, had assumed an almost unreal quality, and that Emilia herself was beginning to slip away. Yet, even in thinking of the future, the apothecary knew that difficulties lay ahead. As soon as his visit to Cornwall was ended, he must return to London, and he felt certain that Elizabeth would refuse to accompany him. Therefore, his principal challenge lay in persuading her to give up her country seat and to dwell with him in town. Yet how he was going to do it, he had no idea. With a determined effort, John tried to put the whole problem out of his mind and concentrate instead on having a thoroughly good time. Elizabeth looked up at him. "What are you thinking?" "About Emilia," he answered truthfully. "You loved her very much," she replied, not as a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes, I did." He held her close. "But now I have fallen in love with you, Elizabeth. In fact, with each passing day it grows a little more." She smiled at him quizzically. "You're certain of this?" "Positive." The Marchesa gave him an inscrutable glance. "And you are contemplating proposing to me, no doubt?" "Well, my sweetest apothecary, I love you too. Who wouldn't? But I will never marry you. Of that you may rest assured." And so saying, she whirled him off his feet in a lively jig. Chapter 10. That night he made love to her with a feeling he had never experienced before, for combined with his passion was a kind of neediness, a longing for her that in some way he knew could never be satisfied. And perhaps, he thought, when he eventually returned to the loneliness of his room, it never should be. For didn't marriage bring with it a necessity of boredom, a familiarity which did not sit easily with the high emotions he felt? The apothecary, undressing, then getting into bed, knew then that whatever fate Elizabeth was going to hand out to him, he would continue to love her despite all. Exhausted, he fell asleep at once, only to dream of little Isabel. In the dream she was standing in the doorway of his room, a mocking smile on her face as she stared at him. "Isabel," he said, "you must stop hiding." "But I've found the perfect place," she answered, and in the way of dreams vanished from his sight. He woke late the next morning to discover Rose standing in exactly the same spot, looking at him in much the same manner. "Come on, Pa, you're very late." "Pass me my watch, sweetheart." Rose retrieved the handsome piece, a 21st birthday present from John's father, Sir Gabriel Kent, and handed it to the apothecary. "Good God, it's 10 o'clock. Why didn't you wake me before?" "I did come in, but you were in a deep sleep." John sat up, feeling somewhat guilty, and saw that Rose was fully dressed. "Who helped you get ready?" he asked. "Mrs. Elizabeth." "Is she up as well?" "She has joined the hunt for Isabel." "Isn't the little toad back yet?" "No, Papa. She stayed out all night." Rose's face took on a slightly virtuous expression, which John found highly amusing. He threw a pillow at her. "And there's no point in trying to look pious," he said. Rose answered, "What does pious mean?" "It means— Oh, never mind. Go downstairs and wait for me. I'll be about 1/4 hour." His daughter duly trotted off, and it was left to the apothecary to wash and shave to the best of his ability, then to hurry into his clothes. Having dressed himself in his travelling suit, prepared for a search, he went down to find Mrs. Pill, white-faced and silent, sitting in the parlour with Tim Painter, who was trying to comfort her in an off-handed sort of way. Diana Warwick was also sitting quietly in a corner, taking in everything that was going on, but saying little. The rest of the guests, including the Marchesa and Rose, were absent. John approached Catherine Pill. "My dear madam, I hear that your daughter has not returned." She turned on him a terrible look. "No, sir. And now I know for certain that something is grievously wrong. The child would have come back as soon as it got dark. I am positive of that." Yet again the apothecary felt a clutch of fear, and took himself to task for not crossing the road and grabbing the girl, even if it had meant disturbing the furry. "When was the last time she was seen?" he asked. "At about 5. Miss Warwick saw Isabel in the street. She called out to her, but the child ran away. Oh, Mr. Rawlings, I blame myself totally for not going to find her." "We could all do that," drawled Tim Painter. Catherine rounded on him. "Yes, and so you should take the blame. I was ill yesterday afternoon and was in no fit state to search, but there was nothing the matter with you." "I'll remind you that I ran all the way to the church, accompanied by Rawlings here, when I heard the girl had been sighted nearby." She looked slightly mollified, but continued in the same vein. "That was good of you, but there was no reason to abandon your duty and go to the tap-room. You should have sought her high and low." Tim looked askance. "I did. So did John. Then we decided that enough was enough, and we'd earned a drink, and that's all I've got to say on the matter." John could not help but admire the man for the way in which he handled the angry female. He felt certain that he, personally, would have cringed with apology and emerged in disarray. Now Tim said airily, "The rest are out looking. Should we join them, Rawlings?" "Yes, let's." Miss Warwick called from her corner. "May I search with you, gentlemen?" "Oh, please do," Tim oozed. Mrs. Pill shot him a black look. "And I shall come too," she announced. "After all, Isabel is my daughter." They went out into the street, where they divided into groups. Tim and Mrs. Pill, who took Painter's arm in a most determined fashion, would search the top part of the town, John and Miss Warwick the bottom end. Looking round for Elizabeth and being unable to see her, the apothecary, out of politeness, offered the beautiful Diana, who this morning looked radiant, his arm. She curtsied, dimpled a smile at him, and took it. Deciding that they should search every alleyway leading off the main road, John plunged into the first. Most of them were stabled yards, but in one he discovered a blacksmith at work. Straightening up at the sound of approaching footsteps, John saw that it was none other than William Trethowan. "Found your little girl, have he?" the constable asked, wiping a huge and dirty hand across his forehead. "No, sir, we haven't," the apothecary replied forthrightly. "In fact, I'm searching for her at this very moment. Now, I believe you said something yesterday about organizing a proper look. Have you done anything about it?" The constable straightened up, looking slightly shamefaced. "If truth be told, sir, I haven't, as yet." "Why not?" John asked, feeling somewhat annoyed. "Because yesterday was Flora Day, and I've only just got back to work. That's as may be. But the fact remains that a child has gone missing and has now been absent all night. So I suggest that a proper search is organized swiftly." At last he seemed to be making headway, for the constable laid down his tools, calling out to another chap, "Rob, I'm off to organize a seeking party. Take over my duties for a while." "Meanwhile," John continued crisply, "the lady and I will continue with our look around." They poked about the yard, Mrs. Warwick standing well clear of anything messy, until they were certain that Isabel was not concealed anywhere. Then they moved on, Diana declaring, that the girl was a little wretch, to be sure. "Do you have children?" John enquired of her tactlessly. Miss Warwick sighed, a pretty sound. "Alas, sir, I am not married." "Tell me," said the apothecary, to cover his confusion, "why did you travel to Helstone on your own, and without a lady companion? What I mean is, of what interest is this pagan dance to you?" She tapped him gently on the face with her fan. "You're very forward, sir, to ask such questions." "Forgive me. I'm just naturally curious." "Well, I came to meet someone, if you must know." John brimmed with curiosity. "Really? And who might that be?" She laughed, her voice the sound of a waterfall. "Now that would be betraying a confidence, would it not? Let it suffice that I tell you I have a friend hereabouts." A male, thought John. He smiled and said, "Madam, I will intrude no further on your privacy. After all, it makes you all the more intriguing that you have a little secret." She smiled up at him, and John thought that she really was one of the most ravishing creatures he had ever seen. Yet again he caught himself wondering how old she was. Returning to Coinage Hall Street, they walked briskly down to where the meadows began. Miss Warwick stared at her elegant dress. "I think, sir, that I should change my clothes if I'm to go searching any further." He was most intrigued by her, and more than a little amused. So much so that despite the power of his feelings for the Marchesa, he could not resist giving Diana's hand a little squeeze. "My dear madam," he said, his eyes very lively, "I would not dream of dragging you over such rough terrain. I shall continue on my own." "But that would be a great pity," she responded, quite definitely flirting with him. "Could we not just tell Mrs. Pill that we got this far, but could not proceed further? Besides, where is the constable going to look? Surely at Low Pool." John stood for a moment, thinking, then decided that he had searched round the pool once, and was damned if he was going to do so again. In fact, he considered, he was not over keen on little Isabel, and was assisting with the search only out of a sense of duty. He turned to Miss Warwick. "Then, if I may escort you back to town—" "Certainly, sir," and she swept a deep curtsy. They did not hurry about their walk back, and consequently were the last to arrive at the Angel, where they discovered Mrs. Pill was holding a council of war. Pale but determined, she was finally managing to instill a sense of worry into her listeners. "I admit," she said, "that Isabel tends to be disobedient and not come when she is called. But for her to stay out all night is unheard of. I tell you in all seriousness that something is amiss. I have seen the constable, and he's organizing a proper search sometime today." "What do you mean by that?" came Tim's beautifully educated voice. "Haven't we looked properly, then?" "There's no need for those remarks," answered Mrs. Pill testily. "It is my opinion that my daughter has been abducted." "But by whom?" asked Mrs. Legassick, who had joined the party with her friends, all of whom had been out looking. "And for what purpose?" Catherine went dangerously white. "Who knows why? Probably for some unlawful design." "Oh, surely not," said a Mr. Colquite, and the other echoed, "Surely not." Anne Anstey put in tactlessly, "Oh, yes, I have heard of young girls being abducted. They take them to work in brothels or to send overseas to tend the plantations." Mrs. Pill made a terrible retching sound, and Tim said, "Steady on." Tabitha Bligh, who clearly regarded Mrs. Anstey as some kind of rival, answered, "How cruel of you to say such things! Why, you could send the poor woman into an hysteric." John, who had been thinking much the same thing, glanced at Mrs. Pill, but saw that with great determination she was remaining in control of herself. "So, what are we going to do?" she asked, her face set and rigid. Everybody stared at everybody else, but nobody said a word. The apothecary broke the silence. We can do nothing until the constable has searched the place. Then, I believe, we must follow his advice." But even as he spoke, he recognized the futility of his words. William Trethowyn was at heart a fairly simple man, and would probably be as puzzled by Isabel's disappearance as everybody else. He addressed Mrs. Pill. "Madam, we have just searched the town. There is nothing we can do further until the constable reports to you."
"You're right, of course. But I have such a sense of futility, a longing to see my child again. Just sitting here makes me feel quite sickened."
"I don't know what to suggest." Elizabeth spoke.
"I believe we should pass the time as pleasantly as possible. Why don't we look round the local shops?"
Mrs. Pill shook her head.
"You go by all means. Personally, I would rather wait here for the constable."
"Do you mind if I take a stroll round?" Tim Paynter asked, fixing Diana Warwick with such a meaningful glance that it shot through John's mind that he might be the man she had come to meet.
No, you go,"
Catherine answered, not noticing. "Thank you." And he made a hasty exit, accompanied by most of the other men, only too glad to get away from the depressing atmosphere. John caught Elizabeth's eye and bowed. "May I accompany you?"
"Provided Rose wants to go, yes."
The child stood up, nodding enthusiastically.
"Yes, please, Papa."
"Then it's settled. We'll go and shop." As he passed Miss Warwick, she gave another deep curtsy. John paused. "Madam, will you be all right on your own?" "I shall find company. Don't worry, sir." "Then I'll bid you good day."
"Good day, sir."
And under her breath she added the words,
"Dearest Mr. Rawlings."
They delayed their return to the hostelry, relishing the time alone together. During their perambulations they passed the 7 friends, Mrs. Legassick and Mrs. Bligh, together with the hot-eyed Anne Anstey, the brothers Colquite, and the other 2 cousins walking dutifully behind. John, somewhat amused by them, said, "I wonder if they ever separate."
"You know very well they do. Didn't you come across the men in the Blue Anchor?"
"Yes, but only once." "Do you think they sleep together, and take turn and turn about?" She laughed, that deep laugh of hers. What an amazing thought! Isn't it, though? But the more he considered it, the more the apothecary began to wonder just what was the nature of the cousins' inseparable relationship. Chapter 11. The constable's search was over, and the news was not good. He had gone to see Mrs. Pill, finding her sitting in the parlour of the Angel, and had solemnly announced that they could not find her child anywhere in Helstone. She had gone stiff with grief, her plain face taking on a mask-like expression.
"Are you saying that my girl has gone?"
she croaked out of drawn white lips. William Trethowyn, looking acutely miserable, shuffled from foot to foot. "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid that is so."
"Then she has been abducted?"
"Unless there's been an accident at Low Pool."
"An accident? What do you mean?"
Totally lacking tact, Trethowyn blundered on. "They do say, round these parts, that every 7 years or so the pool claims a victim." Catherine let out a low cry.
"So that's where she is? Oh, God help me."
"I'm not saying she is there, ma'am. It's just a possibility."
"Then you must send down a good swimmer, someone who can look for her body."
"Ma'am, have you seen the size of the pool? It'd take a strong man several hours to walk around."
"But surely you can organize something. We are talking about my child, my only child."
With these words she started to weep copiously and unattractively, while the wretched constable shifted his weight from one side to the next, looking as if he would rather be anywhere in the world but here. His agony was relieved by the arrival of Tim Paynter, who strolled in nonchalantly, smelling of ale. "Found her?" he asked cheerfully. Then he stole a glance at the loudly weeping Catherine, and added, "Probably not, then." "No, sir," put in Trethowin. "The child is nowhere to be seen." "Well, that's a blow, to be sure. What do you suggest, my good man?" The constable shook his head. "I don't know what to say, sir. I must confess I'm in a spot." Tim turned to Catherine, who was emitting low, convulsive sobs. "Come on now, old girl. There's no need to upset yourself."
"There's every need," she answered in the grimmest tones. "My daughter, my Isabel, is probably dead, and all you can do is make inane remarks. How can you be so unfeeling?"
It was at that moment that the apothecary walked in, having left Elizabeth and Rose slowly walking round the shops. He took one glance at Mrs. Pill and went straight to fetch his medical bag, returning with it a few minutes later and immediately giving her some physic. While he poured, he spoke to William Trethowin. "I presume your search was in vain." "You presume correctly, sir." Wait outside for me a moment. I want to have a chat with you. I'll just attend to Mrs. Pill first." "Are you a doctor?" "An apothecary."
"Good as,"
answered Trethowin, and went out. Painter, meanwhile, was standing beside Catherine, looking and being totally ineffectual, and as if he couldn't wait to get back to the ale-pot. John shot him a severe glance. "Look after her for a moment or two. I just want to have a word with the constable."
"Very well. I'll do my best."
John, feeling uncertain about leaving his patient, stepped outside with a certain reluctance to where Constable Trethowin awaited him. Looking at the man, whose attitude had changed completely since the first time they had met, the apothecary came straight to the point. "Do you think Isabel is dead? Because you know I saw her last evening, as did Miss Warwick." William looked grim.
"I'm aware of that fact, sir. Mr. Painter told me. But I can assure you that she's not hiding. She's either been abducted, or that's what's happened to her."
"But surely she's not been murdered. If she's dead, it must be accidental." But the constable's unswerving stare made him add the words, "I imagine."
"Truth to tell, I don't know what to think, sir. The child is a stranger hereabouts, so you can't say she made any enemies. I've a mind to ask the gypsy woman what she reckons."
John stared at him incredulously. "You don't believe in all that rubbish, do you?" The minute he had spoken, he regretted it, for Trethowin frowned darkly and said,
"I be Cornish, sir, so don't mock me about my beliefs."
"I'm sorry. I meant nothing personal."
"Don't you want to come with me? Aren't you the least bit curious?"
And John had to admit that part of him was intrigued as to what Gypsy Orchard would say, though his sane, sensible self refused to have anything to do with it. He assumed a nonchalant air. "I'll wait for you to report back to me. I must go in search of my companion and my daughter." Trethowin lowered his voice.
"I'd keep a close guard on your maiden, sir."
"Why? What do you mean?"
"There could be funny people about."
John's stomach lurched. "Are you referring to those strange individuals who love children above all other?"
"I am indeed. If Isabel has been abducted, then like as not, there may be one working down here."
"Come to watch the lads and lasses who gather round on Flora Day?"
"Precisely."
The constable pulled out a watch.
"I'm off to try and find Gypsy Orchard, sir. Goodbye."
And John was left staring at his departing back, half wishing that he were going with him. End of Side 5. Side 6. John returned to the parlour to find Mrs. Pill deserted by Tim, sitting on her own, gazing vacantly at the wall. "Would you like to lie down?" he asked. She stared at him listlessly.
"I don't care," she answered. "I won't sleep if I do."
"I can give you a pill that will soothe you."
but I want to stay awake just in case there is any news."
The apothecary felt unable to answer her, so merely cleared his throat. Mrs. Pill put out a bony hand and seized his arm.
"Mr. Rawlings, do you think Isabel is dead?"
she asked, repeating his earlier question to the constable. John shook his head. "I don't know what to say. It is possible, I suppose."
"But if she is not, I tremble to think what might be her fate."
Determined not to go down that road, the apothecary stood up. "I shall go and find Mr. Painter for you." Mrs. Pill sighed.
"That wastrel. Don't bother yourself. I think I am better off on my own."
John, who was rapidly feeling that Tim was a total waste of everyone's time, said nothing, and was saved any further embarrassment by the entry of Rose and Elizabeth. His daughter, he noticed at once, looked tired and somewhat red about the eyes. He raised a mobile brow at the Marchesa, who said quietly,
"She has been upset by Isabel's disappearance."
"She didn't like the girl," he answered in an undertone.
"I know, but that hasn't stopped her feeling sorry."
John, shaking his head with sad amusement, bent down and picked his daughter up into his arms. "You funny little thing," he said.
"Oh, Papa,"
she said, and burying her head in his neck, Rose started to cry. Mrs. Pill sat motionless, and Elizabeth, sitting down beside her, took her hands. John, seizing the moment, carried Rose out into the yard, where they were uninterrupted, except for the stamp and whinny of horses and the occasional plodding of an hostler. Sitting down on the wall by the well, John snuggled the child onto his lap. "What's the matter, darling?"
"Oh, Pa, what has happened to Isabel?"
He sighed. "I wish I knew."
"I didn't like her, but I do feel sorry for her."
"I experience the same emotion."
"You're sure she's not hiding?"
John looked at his child very seriously. "I don't see how she can be. The constable is a local man, and he would have found her if anyone could." Rose wept afresh, and some of her tears fell on John's hands, moving him profoundly. He held his daughter very close, thankful with all his heart that she had not gone missing, loving her as the last vestige on earth of Emilia, wondering what sex his unborn child, the child that perished with its mother, would have been. His reverie was disturbed by the sound of someone approaching, and looking up, he saw that Diana Warwick was coming towards him. Putting Rose down carefully, he stood up and bowed.
"Mr. Rawlings, I was thinking how sweet you looked holding your child. You are a most unusual and loving father."
"I am all that Rose has got," he replied honestly. She looked at him with a bright smile. "But you will remarry, surely?" John's thoughts flew to Elizabeth, and again he answered truthfully, "I'm not sure about that." Diana smiled beautifully. "There's many a woman who would like you for a partner, sir." "It's kind of you to say so." "I only speak the truth." And with that she curtsied and went on to the stables, enquiring audibly about hiring a horse. This put an idea into John's mind, and he turned to Rose. "Would you like to go for a ride?"
"Oh, yes, please, Papa."
"Then we'll ask Mrs. Elizabeth to join us." Half an hour later it was all done. The livery stables, which worked in conjunction with the Angel, had provided them with 2 stout mounts and a pony for the young person. Then the 3 of them clattered out of the stable yard and set off to the right in the direction of Low Pool. Elizabeth, as was usual with her, led off at some speed, particularly when they reached the open country beyond the town. John and Rose followed at a sedate pace, suitable for the child, good rider though she was. So it was that they reached the pool and stopped to marvel at its size and splendour. In the distance, to the right, standing on high ground overlooking the lake, was a great house. But it was not to this that the apothecary's eyes were drawn. He looked instead at the horse that Diana had hired, grazing beneath a tree, its reins loosely looped over a branch. Beside it stood another horse, also cropping the turf. John knew instantly that the lady in question was with her mystery man, and felt his natural curiosity reach overwhelming proportions. Thinking to himself that it couldn't possibly be Tim Paynter, unless the man had moved very fast, he longed to get a glimpse of who it was. Yet his natural revulsion against peeping Toms held sway. He said to Rose, "Shall we dismount, or do you want to search for Mrs. Elizabeth?" Rose turned on him a stricken face.
"She isn't lost too, is she?"
John laughed. "Not she. She's probably just ridden on a little. She'll be back, don't worry."
"Then I'll get off."
And she slid to the ground in quite an expert fashion before John could catch her. He dismounted and stood beside her, looking at the enchanting vista. Then the thought came that if Isabel had vanished into the pool, it would be almost impossible to find the girl. He had seen many lakes, but this one was particularly wooded on its shoreline and would be almost impossible to search. A low laugh, coming from the group of trees to his right, made him glance over, and there, to his great astonishment, he saw Diana Warwick emerging, accompanied by the red-headed, aristocratic-looking Nicholas Kitto. So that was it. She must have met Kitto somewhere, and they had formed a liaison which was still continuing. But why the secrecy, the apothecary wondered. What was it that prevented them from announcing to the world that they were sweethearts? Then it occurred to him that Diana might be married, despite her claiming otherwise, and with it came the certainty that she was a good deal older than young Kitto, possibly even as much as 20 years. Rose, quite unabashed, waved enthusiastically in the manner of children, and called out, "Good day, Miss Warwick." "Good day," she called back, obviously extremely embarrassed. John, meanwhile, was muttering at his daughter, "Just leave it, Rose. Don't say any more." But she either didn't hear him, or was just being wilful, because she called out, "The constable couldn't find Isabel." "I know, my dear. Isn't it a shame?" Meanwhile, Kitto, who had been surveying the scene, decided to make the best of it, and came forward with a grin. "Hello, Rawlings. We meet again." "Yes, indeed," said John over-heartily, attempting to appear nonchalant. "Miss Warwick and I are old friends," continued the young man, flushing despite his brave approach. "Oh, excellent," the apothecary answered in the same vein. "I must be getting back," said Diana. "Oh, really? Well, I'll see you, as arranged, then." And Nicholas bent down to assist his lady-love to mount, cupping his hands together to receive her foot as she climbed into the side-saddle. John was partly amused by the incident, yet greatly puzzled. It seemed to him that there was something odd about the pair of them, but what it was totally eluded him. He felt certain, though, that he would discover it eventually. Elizabeth rode up as Nicholas left, having given Diana several minutes' start. John, observing the Marchesa closely, thought he had never seen anyone as beautiful. Her black hair was loose, flying out as she cantered along, and the colour was fresh in her cheeks. Today she rode side-saddle, something she did not often do, but it suited her well. Only the ugly scar, the flaw in the diamond, detracted from her being totally lovely. She stared at Nicholas's departing back. "I see you had company." "More than that. A little bit of a mystery. I'll tell you about it later." Elizabeth turned her mount so that she was once more surveying the Low. "It's a vast area. Heaven help the child if she's fallen in." "She'll never be found," she added under her breath, conscious of Rose's presence. "I agree," John answered heavily, as the three of them set off for home. Something made him stop at the Blue Anchor, something other than the smell of their home-brewed ale. Telling Elizabeth and Rose to continue on to the inn, John walked in, fairly certain that he would find William Trethowin, and sure enough, the chap was seated in the bar. But this time he wore a serious expression, and was only with one crony, talking quietly. He looked up as John entered, and beckoned the apothecary over. "Now, sir," he began, "I know you don't hold with fortune-telling and the like, But you must remember that Gypsy Orchard is a charmer, and that means she's highly respected round these parts. John sat down. Well, tell me about charmers. What do they do? They are magic people. They can cure all kinds of illnesses and ailments, warts, wounds, adder bites. They can stop bleeding in both people and animals. Gypsy Orchard was born with the gift, and that's why I trust what she says. And what does she say about Isabel? I'd rather you heard that for yourself, sir. Once again, John was seized with a terrible fear, remembering that time so long ago when an old woman had foretold Emilia's death. At the time, he had thought it all trickery and fakery, but events were to prove him wrong. I don't think 'twill be for your benefit, sir. But he could say nothing further. There was a rustle in the doorway, and there she stood, dark and tanned, her basket on her hip, her eyes staring straight into John's soul. And what eyes they were! Clear as a Cornish river, with all the light and shade attached thereto, dancing and glistening in the candlelight. Indeed, as she turned to the constable, John could have sworn that they glinted like emeralds in the gathering shadows. He stood up and bowed. "Madam?" She laughed, lightly and musically. "Just call me Gypsy Orchard, if you would, sir. I am more used to it than anything else." And she put out her hand. John took it, and the second he had done so, felt something of her power. It coursed through him like a flash of lightning. "You're a healer, too," she said. "In fact, that is what you do all the time, and you're very good at it. But you do something else as well. Now what is it?" She closed those remarkable eyes for a few moments. Then they flew open again. "I know," she said. "You hunt down villains and killers. That is the other part of your life." Chapter 12. The gypsy motioned John to sit, and taking a seat beside him, took his hands and turned them palms uppermost. Despite himself, despite his fear of what she might be about to say, he was enthralled. "A complicated man," she said after a few moments, "who has known much joy and much sadness." She lowered her voice so that the constable would not be able to hear her. "You are blessed with the power of healing, and will continue with this work until the day you die." Gypsy Orchard smiled, then gave him an amused look. "You have a daughter, and will also have a son." "My wife is dead," John answered bitterly. "I am aware of that." She grinned at him, and he saw the flash of strong white teeth. "You don't need a wife to get a boy, Apothecary." He couldn't help but smile in return. "Then who will be my son's mother?" "As to that, I am going to keep you guessing. You don't know, do you? You may accuse me of spinning a yarn, but I tell you what I see. It is not wise to mock a charmer, sir." "I'm sorry. I spoke out of turn. Please continue." But she had turned his hands over and given them back to him. "Let's talk about the missing child instead." John, reluctantly realizing that he had spoiled his chance of learning more, said, "Oh, very well. Tell me what you see regarding her." "She's dead, sir. Dead and gone." "You're certain?" "Convinced." "Then how did she die?" "She was drowned. Poor little mite. Gone back to the water from which she came." John shivered despite himself. "Is she in Low Pool?" Gypsy Orchard shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure, to be honest with thee. I felt the waters close round my head, but I was not certain from where they were coming." "And this is what you told the constable?" "Just as I tell it to you now." "Then may God rest her soul." "Amen." They sat in total silence. neither William Trethowyn nor his companion saying a word, and into this quiet there stole the distant sounds of music, which grew louder and louder, until eventually it came through the doors of the inn in a great clamorous cacophony. John looked up, and found himself peering into a small, anxious face, wearing a hat, its body thrust into a jacket, its little hands held out in a piteous gesture. "Hello, little fellow," said John. It was the monkey, for once not carrying the collecting hat, and bearing its usual sad cast of features. Gypsy Orchard said, "It has known suffering, that creature." "What do you mean?" asked John. "It has had a cruel master, but now it is free of him, and with a reasonable crew, particularly the blind man." And she laughed, as if at some joke of her own. John stood up. "Can I cross your palm with silver, milady?" She rose also, so that yet again he was looking into those fresh-water eyes of hers. "No, that is my gift to thee," she said. Trethowyn spoke up. "I reckon we'll have to search the low best we can." John nodded. "Looks like it. I'll try and round up a few strong swimmers." "Aye, do that. Well, goodbye, sir. I'm home to my dinner." Picking up the monkey, John went into the next-door bar to discover the band playing for all they were worth. They stood in the midst of a small crowd, entertaining one and all, and there was a roar of approval when the apothecary entered with their simian pet. "He wandered off, did he?" said the tambourine player, laughing. Taking the creature from John's arms, he handed him his instrument, which the monkey began to play haphazardly. "Well, now, Wilkes, be taking my place, will he?" John laughed. "Is that his name? Wilkes?" "Yes, after that evil politician. But we meet again, sir. As you know, I'm Gideon." "Yes, I remember. The rest of the mob have names, too. The mandora player is Zachariah, and the fagotto Giles. The kettle drums man is George, and the flautist is John." "And your leader, the blind fiddler, what is he called?" Gideon chuckled softly. "He's just known as the Gaffer." "Well, doesn't he have a name?" "Reckon he did, years ago. But he's probably forgot it." "Good gracious. Anyway, allow me to introduce myself. I'm John Rawlings. Nice to make your acquaintance. Let me buy you all a pint of ale before I go." "Obliged to you, sir. We'd like that, wouldn't we, boys?" The members of the band nodded and winked to show their approval, not missing a note of the music as they did so. The Gaffer, meanwhile, was jigging about in time to his own playing, thoroughly enjoying himself. John stared at him, thinking him a jolly good fellow, but wondering what it was about the chap that seemed somehow familiar. It was probably, he concluded, because the blind fiddler was a type, an unusual one, but for all that, a type. The sort that one associated with country fairs and gatherings and dances organized by farming folk. Reluctantly, because he was enjoying the music and the general atmosphere, John made to go, but was stopped in the doorway by Gypsy Orchard. Her white teeth flashed disconcertingly. "Take care of your son when he comes, sir," she said, then laughed and hurried off down the street, her hips swinging, her basket still balanced on one of them, her door-knocker plait woven with flowers from the hedgerows. John stood, shaking his head, and at that moment William Trethowyn, the constable, who had been delayed within, came out of the hostelry. He had changed since their first meeting, the apothecary thought, now having an air of humility where first he had appeared overbearing. He approached John and cleared his throat. "Should I tell Mrs. Pill what Gypsy Orchard said, do you think, sir?" "I think best not, though she'll probably find out from someone." "Poor soul, I pity her. Tell me, is Mr. Painter the child's father?" "Not he. I think he drifts through life trying to have a good time, and he considered little Isabel a hindrance." "Oh." The constable rubbed his chin. "Sufficient to murder her, maybe?" "Do you know?" John answered thoughtfully. "You could well be right." When he got back to the Angel, it was to find that dinner was being served in the dining parlour. Hastily going to his room to change into something more fanciful, a black and silver ensemble somewhat reminiscent of his father's mode of dress, John joined Elizabeth downstairs, only to discover that Rose was missing. "Where is she?" he asked, suddenly panicking. The Marchesa smiled reassuringly. "She was tired out, poor little thing. I put her to bed and she fell asleep immediately." "But she hasn't dined," said John, genuinely worried, unaware of how amusing he looked in his fine fancy rig with such a perturbed face. "Oh, my dear, look at you. You possess all the qualities of a fine mother-hen. A missed meal won't kill the child. Lack of sleep is far more dangerous." The apothecary grinned sheepishly. "You're right. Being a sole parent is very difficult. I've told you before. You will remarry." "Not until the day you say yes, Elizabeth." She gave no answer, but tapped him lightly with her fan. Then she took his arm and went in to dine. Mrs. Pill was absent, and so were Mrs. Legassick and Mrs. Bligh. Anne Anstey, however, was present, sitting alone. She gave him a rapturous smile as he entered, but turned her nose up at the sight of Elizabeth. The 4 male cousins who were not staying at the Angel had come in anyway, and were tucking in heartily to their victuals, particularly the melon-faced man, who considered himself a sure card, and was, as usual, holding forth between chews. Diana Warwick, looking ravishing in a gown of palest blue, also sat alone, wistfully sipping soup. John made much of bowing to her, but gave only the smallest salutation to Mrs. Anstey. Elizabeth, inclining her head graciously to the assembled company, allowed John to help her into a chair, then sat serenely while he ordered wine. "Mrs. Pill must be resting," she said in an undertone. "Clearly, yes." But they were not able to pursue this topic of conversation, for at that moment the door of the dining parlour was flung open to reveal Tim Painter, looking for all the world as if he had stepped straight out of a fashion plate, his dark hair tied back in an exquisite bow, his lilac suit glittering with embroidery in deep blue. He bowed to the entire room. "Good evening," he said, his delicious voice filling the empty corners. Then he saw Miss Warwick, and in one stride had arrived at her table. "Madam, may I join you?" Nicholas Kitto or no Nicholas Kitto, Diana was clearly attracted to the gorgeous man standing before her. "Mrs. Pill is not with you, sir?" "No, she's taken to her bed." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yes, of course you may. I shall be pleased with the company." "Then I will gladly oblige." And taking up her hand, which had been resting on the tabletop, Tim kissed it long and lingeringly. The entire room, which had gone silent during this exchange, now burst into conversation. "Well, I reckon he's on to a winner," said Sace, the melon man, and burst into guffaws of laughter, despite the fact that he still had food in his mouth. "Shush!" whispered one of the Colquites. "Damned if I will!" Sace roared, and wiped his eyes with his napkin, meanwhile stealing a glance round the room to see if others were watching him. Elizabeth raised a brow at John. "Tim wasted no time, I see," she whispered. "He's a randy lad for sure," the apothecary murmured back. "I wonder how far he will get." John raised a suave eyebrow back at her. "Her heart is supposedly taken by another." Elizabeth leant forward. "Really? Who?" "A young local blade called Nicholas Kitto. You saw him depart, at least I think you did, from Low Pool this afternoon." The Marchesa's eyes glistened. "Tell me all that you know." "Not much, really. Simply that Miss Warwick, who I would estimate is several years his senior, met the young fellow somewhere or other, and they have set up a clandestine affair. Does one or other of them have disapproving parents?" "Nicholas, I would imagine. I can't quite imagine Diana having parents." Elizabeth pealed with laughter, and John silently drew breath. At that moment, He felt that he stood outside himself and looked on the scene, knowing that all his life, come what may between him and the dark-haired, scar-faced woman with whom he would like to throw in his lot, this would be something he would remember always. The sable loveliness of her, throwing her head back in the candlelight, appreciating his humour, at ease with him in every way. It was at this juncture that Sace belched loudly and said, "By Gad, that was damnable good food." He stood up, his little eyes taking in the entire room, who stared at him, some friendly, others wishing the man would be silent and sit down again. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give you a toast. I raise my glass to those master chefs who have laboured behind the scenes to prepare tonight's feast. I ask you all to rise and drink to them." John, finding the fellow a total bore, nonetheless got to his feet, as did Elizabeth. "The cooks, God bless 'em," said Sace. Everyone drank, including Tim Painter and Diana Warwick, then sat down again, rather hurriedly, John thought. But Sace wasn't done with them yet. He remained standing and launched into an anecdote. "Forgive me, one and all, if I may crave your attention a moment more. I want to tell you a yarn of my boyhood." His voice rambled on, punctuated with a great many wheezing laughs and thigh-slaps, and all the time his tiny, mean eyes were seeking out the company, looking for approbation, demanding attention, playing to his audience of would-be admirers. Tim had long since stopped paying the man any heed, and was concentrating all his charm on Diana. Leaning across the table, he covered one of her hands with his, and muttered something inaudible. John said, with asperity, "I would have thought he might have paid some small consideration to Mrs. Pill." "Not he," Elizabeth answered. "Mr. Painter is a man with an eye to the main chance in life. As long as his next drink is guaranteed, as long as his next mistress, be she only for a night or two, is provided, then he is happy. He is an opportunist, and the pangs of conscience that might allay the rest of us for things done or not done simply don't apply to him." "Then he is brutal," John answered softly. "I don't think he would agree. In his mind, he cares about people, worries about them. But in reality, he doesn't give a straw." Mutually, they looked over at the subject of their conversation, and saw that he now held both Diana's hands and was gazing at her with a steadfast expression on his face. Mr. Sace stopped his discourse at this juncture and sat down amidst half-hearted applause. Everyone started to concentrate on their food once more, with the notable exception of Anne Anstey, who suddenly began to choke, gazing piteously over a white napkin which she held tightly to her mouth. "Oh, dear," John murmured to Elizabeth. "I have a feeling I'm about to be summoned." Digging into her game pie, the Marchesa merely rolled her eyes at him in silent agreement. Mrs. Anstey continued to make alarming noises to the point that John stood up and crossed over to her table. "Can I assist you, madam? Perhaps a glass of water might help." For answer, Mrs. Anstey heaved violently, though thankfully not productively. John sidestepped. "I must get out," she gasped, and practically threw herself into his arms. Throwing a desperate glance at Elizabeth, who most unsympathetically just grinned, the apothecary began to lead her from the room. Sace stood up. "Can I do anything?" he asked, glancing round the diners to make sure he had been noticed. "Yes, accompany us if you would," John answered desperately, struggling under Anne's not inconsiderable weight. "Certainly, old boy. Keep a cool head in a crisis, Sace, my old mamma always used to say." Together, staggering slightly, the two men took Mrs. Anstey outside the dining parlour and into the hallway, where she stood gasping and clutching her abdomen. John took the opportunity to race upstairs for his bag of medicines. On his return, however, he found both Sace and the woman concerned had vanished. Feeling annoyed, he marched back into the dining parlour, to discover Anne Anstey fully recovered, drinking a glass of wine and toasting Eustace Sayce, who, in return, was glowing in her fulsome compliments, together with the rest of his party. Angrily, John sat down. "Well, I must say—" Elizabeth whispered, "Oh, come now. Surely you're glad to be rid of her. I'll swear she has designs on you." "Yes, you're right." He looked round and saw to his astonishment that Tim and Diana were also absent. And where did they go? "Only one place I can think of," Elizabeth answered, and slowly winked her eye. Chapter 13. In the eerie light of dawning, Low Pool had taken on a dark and sinister air, very different from the warm and pleasant aspect of the previous afternoon. Seeing it, the rising sun striking the sheet of water and burnishing it to gold, John felt that it had a mysterious quality, a quality of things unseen and unspoken, and for a moment felt his imagination run wild, wondering whether a merry maid splashed in its depths. He had gathered together 3 strong swimmers, himself, Jed, and Rufus, the coachman and the guard, who had been having an excellent time of it in Helstone, spending every day at leisure and every night in the tap-room. The only restriction to their total freedom had been the apothecary's insistence that they remain at the Angel in the evenings, keeping an ear out for Rose and occasionally checking her welfare. Other than for that small duty, they had had a complete rest from work. But now they had been called in to help look for the body of Isabel Pill. John had hoped to bring Tim Painter in to assist, but there had been no sign of him last night after his sudden disappearance with Diana, and to call him this morning would have been bad manners indeed. So the apothecary and his small contingent had presented themselves to the constable before first light and declared themselves willing to undertake the grisly task that lay ahead. William Trethowan, in company with 3 other powerful men, had met them at the bottom of Coinage Hall Street, and then the little troop had walked the rest of the way to the Low and arrived just as the sun was glinting over the horizon. "If she's there, she'll be in the shallows, but if she was murdered, then her killer might have had a boat and weighted her down." John shook his head. "If she was killed, then whoever did it acted on the spur of the moment. I feel certain of it." "Then she should be somewhere where we can get at her. So let's to it." He positioned his men at 1/4-mile intervals and told them to dive in and look around, then, having covered the delegated area, to keep moving on. But even as he set them the task, the constable had a hopeless air about him, as if he knew that however hard they searched, they would come up with nothing. John, diving into the green water, found it depressing and rather horrible, and not a task that he would wish on anyone. And when he surfaced, having ploughed his way through weeds, he could see in the distance that Rufus and Jed were equally miserable at the task which it had been their duty to perform. Eventually, though, after 4 hours searching, the constable called the wretched business off. "It's useless, lads. There's nothing down there but dead dogs. If the maiden's in the Low, then she's sunk to where we can't get her. What'll us do, Willem?" "Leave it be. There's naught else. I'll have to see her mother and tell her straightly what's transpired." "I'll come with you if you like," the apothecary offered. "No, sir. It's a grim task, but I'll do it on my own," the constable replied with dignity, earning himself even more credit in John's eyes. End of Side 6.